The Sodor and Mainland Railway was the first railway on Sodor to use locomotives. Opened in 1861, trains ran on the line for 40 years before the company went bankrupt and operations ceased in 1901. 3 engines ran the railway, but only one of them appeared in the Railway series books, and his appearance was brief. Time for me to open up Sketchbook Pro and draw these 3 little engines. The 3 engines that operated the S&M were all engines of the same class, the Neilson box tank. As the name suggests, these are a class of boxy tank engines built by Neilsons of Glasgow. Now I know what you're thinking, a video in which I draw the same type of engine 3 times sounds a bit dull. However, it's worth noting that these little engines came in a number of guises depending on the type of work they were expected to do. In the case of number 1, I've decided to do the unthinkable and give him a cab. My line of thinking is that the Sodor and Mainland engines all arrived on Sodor looking the same as one another, but were modified over the years. When steel was due for his first overhaul, he was rebuilt with a cab to see if such a thing was worth adopting for the railway's whole fleet. Although the Sodor and Mainland was plagued with financial troubles, and as such, steel was the only engine on the line to ever receive a cab. It did make him quite popular with engine crews, however, particularly during wet and windy days. Steel was a bit of a clumsy engine and had a tendency to lollop along the line in a rough, violent manner. Whilst the engine crews liked the extra shelter provided by his cab, the downside was that the cab upset Steel's balance even more, and he would regularly bounce the crew about, sometimes knocking them off his footplate and even coming off the rails. Pictured here is probably one of the last times Steel was ever entrusted with passenger duties. This is my interpretation of Kaer Station in the Sodor and Mainland era. I have based it, as you do, on St Aubyn's railway station on the Jersey Railway. I like the idea of a small terminus station with only a couple of platforms, but it still has a glass roof like you'd expect from a much larger terminus station. In the TV series, Kaer also has an overall covered roof, although that station is much bigger than I've drawn it here. This is more the size I'd expect of a terminus station of a railway with 3 small engines. The fact that these engines are all basically just boxes on wheels makes them fairly quick and easy to draw. I've depicted steel coupled to some very Victorian looking coaches. Speaking of Victorian, I really wanted to evoke a 19th century look for the illustration, and I figured that the best way to do that was to draw a bunch of people on the platforms in Victorian get-up. Plenty of gentlemen with top hats and sideburns, and women with fancy hats and long dresses. With all that said, here is the illustration complete. Compared to the other 2 Sodor and Mainland engines, we know quite a bit about Neil. He has a somewhat prominent appearance in the book Very Old Engines, having a small speaking role and appearing in a whopping 5 illustrations. Not only that, but during the turn of the millennium he even received some merchandise. In fact, my introduction to Neil was the Thomas Wooden Railway toy of him. At the time I thought he'd just been completely made up in order to sell toys, and yet I still wanted him, so I asked for him and I still have him to this day. Neil also received a toy in the Ertl diecast range, and I made sure to pick it up when it came out in the early 2000s. He's more proportionate than the wooden toy, but the face is a bit of a letdown. When I first read the complete collection of the Railway series, my mind was blown when I realised that not only was Neil a character in the original books, but he was one of the first engines on the entire island of Sodor. In Very Old Engines, Skarloey describes Neil as ugly but kind. His Thomas Wooden Railway character card, on the other hand, calls him a simple but kind engine. In hindsight, this is probably in reference to his appearance, but I always interpreted it as Neil not being the sharpest tool in the engine shed. Perhaps the other two engines on the Sodor and Mainland are a bit quick-witted and tease Neil for being a bit slow. This could make Neil feel a bit small, which is only compounded when numbers 1 and 3 get rebuilds whilst Neil remains in original condition, literally making him the smallest of the three engines. This could be why he gets on so well with Skarloey and Rheneas. He knows what it's like to feel small, and wants to be there for the little engines so that they don't go through the same grief as he did. According to Audrey's Railways of Sodor lecture, Neil was eventually sold off to the Crovansgate Mining Company, where he was presumably put to work in one of their quarries. It was for this reason that Neil was able to survive beyond the closure of the Sodor and Mainland Railway, and is thought to still be around today. I like to think that he was eventually preserved, either by the North Western Railway or privately by a group of enthusiasts, and is normally on static display, but is sometimes restored to working order to run special rail tours on his old stomping grounds. Neil enjoys getting to stretch his wheels, but enjoys catching up with Skarloey and Rheneas even more. So much has changed over the past 100 years, I can hardly keep up. You dinna ken how grateful I am to see some familiar faces. Skarloey and Rheneas are equally happy to see Neil when and where they can. Here's Neil pulling a charter service with some vintage coaches, possibly replicas, while Skarloey and Rheneas give him a warm welcome. With all that said, here is the finished drawing. As I mentioned before, the Neilson box tanks had a number of different variations. One that particularly stuck out to me was the variant where the engine's frames are extended to accommodate a trailing axle, turning the design from an 040 into an 042. My line of thinking is that the Sodor and Mainland Railway probably had one of their engines rebuilt in this form as a means of addressing the engine's rough riding. Emil's rebuild was effective, but as I previously said, the Sodor and Mainland didn't have a lot of money to spare, and so their plans to rebuild the other two engines in the same vein unfortunately fell by the wayside. While Steele was brash but clumsy, and Neil was slow but kind, Emil prided himself on his sensibility and determination. He was generally the railwayman's preferred engine due to his extra wheels providing smooth running, and was happy to do the jobs that the other two either struggled with or refused to do. Unfortunately, he could get a bit snooty, and believed that he was the best of the three engines. He often squabbled with the much blunter and more uncouth Steele, but even kind Neil wasn't safe from Emil's overbearing behaviour. Emil would often use Neil's slow wit as an excuse to patronise him, making him feel very insignificant. Neil hated it, but there was no getting through Emil's thick smoke box. He just thought that Neil was being ungrateful. Emil would frequently boast that he could probably run the railway by himself, and eventually the opportunity arose. Neil was the first to go, being sold off to the Crovansgate Mining Company. Steele was eventually worn out, and with no money to fund an overhaul, he was scrapped. Emil was the last engine on the railway, with nobody else to fall back on for help. Not that he needed it, or so he thought. Eventually, the Sodor and Mainland went bankrupt. The final train departed from Kirkronan station in 1901. It was to connect with Skarloey's train at Crovan's Gate before continuing on to Ballyhoo. Skarloey waited and waited, before his passengers eventually arrived via a stagecoach. Poor Emil had become so worn out that he'd completely given up the ghost before making it to Crovan's Gate. Neither Skarloey nor Rheneas ever saw him again, and it would be another 13 years before standard gauge engines would return to the former Sodor and Mainland metals. I've drawn Emil in his prime, hauling a set of stone trucks. I've depicted a scene on the outskirts of the town of Rolf's Castle, with the railway going under a road bridge and crossing the Howin Croker. I suppose this is a bit like a railway series equivalent of the three-way road from the TV series. With that said and done, here is the final version of the image. And there we are, the 3 Sodor and Mainland engines according to me. Having 3 engines of the same design is perhaps a bit limiting, but limitations can drive creativity, and I think I managed to come up with some fairly creative character ideas and designs for the 3 box tanks. Let me know what you think, and whether or not you had a favourite. Be sure to comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already.